Morning everybody, welcome to today's webinar with UKC3. We're really delighted to have you here to come and join us and learn a little bit about what we're doing and hopefully have some conversation, ask some questions, engage in the process today. I'm Ben Shorrock, I'm one of the directors at UKC3, so really pleased to be here to host today. I'll be on and off the virtual stage just to help compare and bring people on and off and have some questions and some conversations. But I promise I won't take up too much of your time. Please do put comments and ask questions throughout the session. What you should see within the window that you're in within the studio session, there's a way for you to ask questions. I think it's called Q&A from memory. So please put any questions you have in there. If you want to make more general comments and talk about what we're doing, please do that, but put it inside the studio chat rather than the general event chat. That's because we are in a backstage area and we can't see what's happening in the general event chat. So we'll just ignore those messages because we can't see them. So make sure you put them in the chat for this specific session rather than for the whole event. That's pretty much it from me. What I'm going to do now is hand over to my colleague Linda. Linda is the chair of UKC3. Unfortunately, she hasn't been able to be here today, but she has pre-recorded a video like she's won an Oscar, talking about a little bit about who she is in UKC3 and why we're doing this work. So I'll hand over to Linda and then we'll get to Rich, who's going to talk about some of the really exciting work they've been doing. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar from UKC3. Today's title, Empowering a Secure Digital Future for the UK, is brought to you by the UKC3 team. I'm very pleased to say that I'm going to be joined today by another board member, Ben Shorrock, from Bristol and Bath Cyber Cluster, and Richard Yorke will be speaking in respect to his own cybersecurity business and his former role as CEO of CyNam, Cheltenham's cybersecurity cluster. So I'm Linda Smith, I'm chair of UKC3. Our board is made up of 5 board members and we are all representatives of our own cluster network across the UK. UKC3 is a platform that was brought to life in 2021 with funding from the former Department for Culture, Media and Sport, now the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And following the UK government launch of the National Cyber Strategy for the UK in December 2021, we were funded to initiate growth in 3 particular themes for the wider UK cyber security sector and to grow in regional specialisms and locations the network to again support future jobs, future academic research and creating more awareness of the specialisms that were evolving and are growing across the UK. Our vision is again in line with this national cyber strategy, but about a safe and prosperous UK, and obviously the £10 billion quoted for the value of the economic value for this sector and the growth predicted by the 2030 vision that's enclosed in that document. Our mission, again, through clusters, and by clusters we mean the actual kind of representatives from particular geographies across the UK, and that includes the nations as well, Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland as part of our network, and again UKC3 being the representative body for the whole of that network. Funding principles, again, I won't go into too much detail because, again, this is about the empowering of a secure and digital future for the UK today. And I want my fellow presenters to also bring their knowledge, expertise and view to this particular webinar. But really, again, I just want to make sure that you, our audience today, is aware of the UKC3 offer and really what our purpose is in supporting growth of the UK cyber sector. The network currently is made up of 15 cybersecurity clusters. As I mentioned, this does include the 3 nations. But when we started UKC3 in May 2021, there were 10 of us. So we've seen growth of 5 clusters since our start point. And again, we're looking for further growth. We think we'll reach about 20 clusters in the next 12 to 18 months. So again, good land coverage of the UK network, and also where there are opportunities for growth in this cyber sector. And as we're seeing, the word cyber is morphing and evolving into the new emerging technologies, digital twins, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all the piece around security by design. So looking at, the landscape, the UK landscape, we're already seeing great activity across a multitude of new opportunities and industry sectors. Everything from the core manufacturing, logistics and shipping, the utilities, energy and kind of environment, health tech, med tech, military, marine, and again, we're playing to our strengths. So hopefully, as we grow, as UKC3 grows, we will see where that strengthening of our offer really starts to shine. In, as I said, just over 2 3/4 years now, these are just some of the stats of our kind of our activities so far. And I think I'm very proud of our cluster network and the events they are churning, the events we're representing the UK cyber industry at, and how the numbers are attracting new members because of what's being offered across the variety. These clusters all have their own personalities, and they, again, will be taking particular leads on themes according to their area and geography. We all read the news about the levelling up agenda and where the UK is investing in particular regions through new industry-based projects and innovation-led projects. But the 3 themes for UKC3 are skills, innovation, and ecosystem. And as you can see by these very impressive statistics, that we're on the move, we're on the march. We've got a long way to go, and again, we're only as good as the networks we're growing. But clusters are growing in number. The memberships are growing in number, and again, making use of these new funded, innovation-led and skills, the future workforce, again, is really important that UKC3 supports and drives those many initiatives that are coming to market. The key priorities, again, just to reinforce a few of these, about raising awareness of cyber through our cluster network, supporting the development of the talent and the future workforce pipeline. Again, we hear time and time again about the shortage of skills in this particular area. So again, if we are going to strengthen our ecosystem, this again, the skills development, really important, right from school entry right the way through for career change as well. So those opportunities are again brought through the cluster network to the locations and working with major stakeholders in their locations as well. The creation and development and growth of cybersecurity, and again, where businesses from an adoption point of view, some sectors slower than others, again, kind of, unsure of that marketplace. But as we read in, I think if you look at the kind of statistics on malware and, cyber crime, which our government department, NCSC, is doing a major job on bringing awareness and schemes to industry, academia, and the public. But again, UKC3 is a conduit to get some of those initiatives out to market. And support cyber research, again, really important. We have some leading universities across the UK and innovation establishments. We have academic centres of excellence in cybersecurity and in our research. And again, through some of our globally recognised expertise, these are areas from an economic perspective that we can be really driving and showcasing to the world to promote the UK excellence in this particular discipline. That's all from me now. As I said, just a brief introduction about UKC3. And I'm going to hand over now to Richard Yorke for his perspective and talk today in support of this webinar. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Linda, for the kind introduction there, and thank you, Ben, as well, for inviting me to talk today. My name's Rich Yorke, as Linda has said. I am, well, have been up until today. It's my last day actually as managing director of CyNam, and prior to that, I've been a board member and chair of UKC3. And what I've been asked to talk to you about today is based on a UKC3 funded project that CyNam delivered with partners in the region around the agri-tech sector and the security of that and the threats and opportunities. So what I thought I would sort of do as well, though, is just kind of set the scene as to what we have been seeing as the threats and opportunities, not just to the agri-tech and food security sector, but to the critical national infrastructure sector as a whole, because there's been some quite significant changes over the last few years. So I'll sort of set the scene there in terms of the wider C&I sector, and then get into what we've seen in the agri-tech and food security sector, what we learned from our project, and what we think the next steps are, and hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. So I guess the first thing is, what's changed, and there's two elements to this. There's the change in terms of the threats, so the threat landscape, and there's also changes to the attack surface of the critical national infrastructure and food security agri-tech sectors as well. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about the threat landscape first. So I think there's increasing risk and threat coming from nation-state actors. Those of you that were at Cyber UK in April this year will have heard this. It's quite unprecedented to announce it so publicly, but the threat from Russia, but then crucially also groups that are sympathetic to the Russian cause. And I think what's really sort of I guess changed as well with this is because they're not directly controlled by the state, they're not equally motivated by financial aims, they're much less predictable, and therefore the attacks or the threats that they bring can have sort of far wider consequences, and have much less able to respond to them. So I think that's something that's changed markedly in the last 2 years or so since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, for example, Russian language criminal gangs, and the things that they're still doing, and still the number one kind of risk is ransomware, and using ransomware as a service type models to attack high profile targets within the critical national infrastructure sector. But there's also other nation states as well. So China and Iran also conducting attacks or attempted attacks on the critical national infrastructure sector, either looking to disrupt, perhaps degrade services, to have greater influence in the geopolitical sphere rather, and in some cases looking to steal intellectual property. And we've seen this in the news. There's been lots of NCSC warnings, also backed up by similar warnings from partners across the Five Eyes community, across our allies in the US, Australia, etc. And this is attacking everything from energy, telecoms, but clearly food production as well. And what this has led to actually is specific guidance for the C&I sector, and then also a sort of relaunching and re-energizing around the cyber assessment framework that the NCSC have put out. So that's kind of a summary of the changing in the threat landscape. So what I'd like to just touch on now is kind of that change in what we call the attack surface. So how are things changing, and why is that also creating a challenge? So if you think of critical national infrastructure historically, so going back decades, it was mainly using control rooms like here in the slide that you can see. So operational technology, there wasn't the concept of the internet, and it certainly wasn't connected to the internet. But over time, as they've increasingly digitized services, they've moved from control centers like this to more digitized ones like this. And in lots of cases, they've combined those two things. So operational technology and IT have been connected together. And as a result, operational technology now has a presence on the internet that can then be exploited. So that's a change in the attack surface, particularly in areas like the energy and transportation sector. And then if you think, to bring it back to the kind of topic of today around agriculture, we've seen significant changes there in the adoption of technology. So moving from more traditional farming methods, which clearly are still a large part of the sector, but what we're increasingly seeing now are more technology-driven uses within the sector. So this is a vertical farm, for instance, which is very reliant on data and connectivity and the use of sensors, etc., to control the environments in which the food that we all rely on continues to grow. And consequently, this is a change that we're starting to see is actually the cybersecurity risk to the food sector and agriculture sector is starting. I would say it's still early days, but it's starting to become recognised, and we see a few headlines there around from the BBC, from some American news outlets as well, looking at the potential impact on food supply chains being at risk as things are increasingly digitised. I think we saw an attack on John Deere, the tractor manufacturer, as well in the last 18 months to 2 years. And we see this as a trend that's going to continue for both the reasons of increased threat from those nation-state actors, but then also because of increased digitisation and the adoption of technology. But I'm here today not just to talk about the threats, but actually what are the opportunities? Because as a cluster, we're there to try and help grow the sector and support the cyber tech and cybersecurity businesses within our region to grow and flourish, and in doing so, help make the UK a more safer and secure place. And so what led to the start of the project that I've mentioned is that we believe there's an opportunity for the cyber tech sector to play a more active role in securing the agriculture and food security sectors as they start to adopt new technologies. And within our region, so Cheltenham and the Gloucestershire area, agri-tech is a regional strength. So we have Hartbury College and University, we have the Royal Agricultural University, both of which have innovation centres focused on the development of agri-tech, so Farm 491 at the Royal Agricultural University, for example, and as well as lots of farming and agricultural providers across the county. We also, over in the Forest of Dean, have what's being billed as one of the largest vertical farms in the world being developed. So just for clarity, a vertical farm is a farm that's grown that grows produce within a controlled environment, and the idea is that can be produced much closer to where it's needed and consumed, and therefore is more efficient and potentially more friendly to the environment as well. And what we discovered when speaking with members of our cluster and with the agri-tech sector and stakeholders from there, there's very little crossover between the cyber sector and the agri-tech sector, and we felt it would be mutually beneficial if we could help make the Gloucestershire and the UK agri-tech sector differentiated in the market by being the most secure that it can be, and also then in doing so creating a new market for cyber tech businesses. So we looked at this and said, well, what is holding this back? Why isn't this kind of naturally happening? And we felt that one of the key points here was there was a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, both ways. So a lack of knowledge of the agriculture sector and where it's going from a technology perspective by our friends in the cyber tech sector, and vice versa. We very quickly understood that the agri-tech and food security sectors don't necessarily have a strong appreciation of the cybersecurity sector and some of the risks and threats that they need to mitigate and manage. So we set out to do two things. So working with those partners at Hartbury College, the Royal Agricultural University, a company called Configured Things as well, who did a lot of work on this on our behalf, and then also a data aggregator working in the agriculture sector called Map of Ag. And what we wanted to do is provide I suppose, a baseline of common understanding across agriculture, agri-tech, and the cyber and technology communities. And then also, as part of that, develop a framework for conversations to happen and meaningful discussions to take place around the risks to the agri-tech sector and how the cybersecurity industry can help address those. So what we did, as well as producing some collateral, which I'll touch on later, we ran a number of knowledge exchange events where we brought together the cyber tech sector with the agriculture sector, with those colleges and universities, to help each other learn more about one another's industry. And then we ran specific workshops, which I'll touch on shortly, around areas of risk and threat and a subset of the agri-tech sector, to understand more around the security risks and how the industry, cyber industry, can get involved to help manage those. And then we also conducted one-to-one interviews with farmers, with tech providers, and with data aggregators that are working in the sector. So an important part of our work on this, as well as the events and the interactions and the relationships that helped establish, was a framework that our friends at Configured Things put together for us. And essentially, it was broken down into a number of things. So one key aspect was a data model. So this was an attempt to look at, across the agri-tech sector as a whole, the flows of data between all the way from farmers through to data aggregators, through to supermarkets and consumers, and everything else involved in the supply chain. And the reason we put this together was because we felt this would provide a hopefully relatively easy to understand sort of framework and model for understanding the risks and those points of engagement for the sector. We then also drilled in on two areas, acknowledging that there is obviously a lot more to the sector than just these two areas, but two areas where we're seeing quite a lot of change in the last few years, and conducted them what we call a stride analysis across those areas, so a threat analysis and risk analysis, working with both the cyber sector and people from these areas of technology. And those two areas were the use of LoRaWAN, so sensors on the farms, which we're increasingly seeing being used. And then, as I mentioned before, data aggregators. So, for example, Map of Ag. So they work with both, for example, supermarkets, so at the end of the supply chain, and the producers. So they collect data from farmers that can enable supermarkets to understand things like, for example, the carbon footprint of producing beef, or the quality of the wheat, or how much water is used to produce fresh produce. So useful data both for the farms, but equally for those throughout the food supply chain. And that was important, that we worked with those data aggregators and understood the sort of risks there, as well as those use of sensors. There clearly is a much wider aspect to agri-tech, and more that we could go into, but for the purpose of this project, those were the two areas of priority. And all of this was captured down in a report which you can access from the CyNam website, and that kind of summarizes the model, how we used it, and then some key findings and learning points that we took from the project, which I'll kind of summarise now. I think one of the key ones here is the perception of the threat, so this is quite interesting, something we perhaps didn't expect given the importance of sort of food security to our day-to-day lives. So I think there is 13 CNI sectors. Food security certainly is one of them, but it seems to be a general perception that the food security industry is sort of the threat, or the risk rather, is low, and there's various reasons for that. I think one is interestingly around the complexity of the sector, and I think that complexity comes from the fact that there's a lot of diversity in the supply chain, a lot of farms, for example, all using different types of technology. So the impact that gives us, actually, from a resilience perspective, is that the diversity means that if an individual farm is attacked, it doesn't necessarily impact the wider supply chain, and it also means that it's good for resilience. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good for security. So complexity was sort of very much viewed as a double-edged sword in that regard. So that diversity, though, that there is through the complexity of the sector does give us resilience, but we feel it's only for now, and actually as technology is adopted and automated systems are implemented, this is actually going to start to remove diversity across farms, and then starting as a result to make farms vulnerable to common attack vectors that target specific technologies as they're used more widely. The other thing as well, and I guess this is explained by the previous points, is that there's a lack of demand for cyber and cybersecurity services within the agri-tech sector. Various reasons for this. One is that data and digital is not at the top of farmers' lists of worries. They're often having to adopt technologies and technological solutions simply to remain viable. And a lot of this technology as well is being provided by agri-tech startups that are very much investment driven. And at the moment, and we hope we can change this, those investors are not demanding high levels of cyber security. Also as well, I think it's important to say that farmers can't be expected to manage and mitigate the risks of cybersecurity, and as a result, they won't be the buyers of cybersecurity technology. Farms typically operate as price takers, and at a relatively small scale compared to other parts of the food supply chain. So they're really poorly equipped to understand the cyber risks that they face, and the systems that they rely on. So that's something that we've taken into the report and taken from the project, is actually to make a difference and to work with the agri-tech sector. It's important to work with the technology providers, work with the data aggregators, but also work at the other end of the supply chain, so supermarkets and those that pull from multiple farmers, because they can influence change through policy and also have the buying power to adopt the necessary technology changes. I think one also important point to note from a use of language perspective, where we found we had much greater traction and interest when we talked about positioning a discussion around resilience. So how do you keep your farm operating rather than security, which seemed more linked to risks such as data theft, which just didn't really resonate with the farming community. So there is a perception, I think, with all of this, as we've touched on, the lack of demand, the fact that the threat is perceived to be low because of diversity, that we could be, without wanting to over dramatize things, entering into a perfect storm. The agri-tech sector is largely targeted at the producers and does not get much attention from a security perspective, as we've said. And there's at the moment not a clear stakeholder that's creating that demand for cybersecurity. And adoption of technology is much more of a necessity for farmers rather than a choice. And as we said, they're not really in a position to assess technical risk. It's not seen as a compelling differentiator. I think as more attacks happen and they become more of the news, this may change. But at the moment, they're driven by investors who are looking at revenue generation and the move to profitability. And so we feel there may be the ingredients for a perfect storm, this rapid adoption and expansion of technology, particularly as that starts to standardize, then that's going to erode the diversity that's currently providing resilience in the sector. But I don't want to leave the talk today with a sort of doom and gloom slide. As I say, I think there is a lot that we've learned from this project. And in conclusion, yes, there is a risk of a storm coming. There's a risk of increased threats, a risk of the increased attack surface, and the agriculture sector is not as well positioned as others to address those. But as a result of the work that we've done, we now have a framework that the cyber industry can use to start those necessary conversations in the right way from an informed position, using language that both farmers and the wider food security industry can understand and relate to. But I think just sort of leave with that point, when we are having those conversations as a cyber industry, we must ensure we're having them with the right people, the right organisations. So that's the investors in agri-tech, the tech providers, those data aggregators, and ultimately those further down the supply chain, such as the supermarkets. Yes, let's not try selling cyber to farmers. Let's support them by working with those other organisations to improve the resilience of the sector. So that was a very quick summary of the work that we did. I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome, thanks, Rich. That was really interesting. I think that was the first time I've heard it in that amount of detail, so I found it really interesting. As Rich said, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section or the stage chat. But before we get to those, I had a couple of questions for you from when I was listening. Yeah. It's really interesting, this sort of piece about thinking about supply chains and where the ultimate responsibility for resilience and security must sit. And I guess one of those big challenges, whether it's agriculture or other sectors, is lots of them are small businesses, aren't they? They're small family-owned businesses, SMEs. So I guess part of the piece you saw from the report was, how do we, as an industry, make sure that we're resilient and secure, and where should that sit? And are you suggesting for agriculture at least that needs to go up that supply chain, or further down the supply chain, I guess is the reality?
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. I think it is unfair to put pressure and the burden of responsibility onto farmers. They have, mentioned that their price takers, their margins are tiny and getting squeezed, year on year. So, let's also focus on what they do best, and what farmers do best is stewarding the land and producing the food and things that we rely on. So it makes a lot more sense to then focus further down the supply chain. Particularly with the technology providers. You mentioned, I think we can influence that through making it more of a higher importance for investors, and maybe doing that rather than from the negative of saying, well, if you don't protect your investment, then these bad things will happen. Actually looking at it as a way to differentiate, to say, actually, this company agri-tech company we've invested in takes security seriously, and as a result, that should drive commercial benefits, enable them to, export perhaps into other markets where security isn't quite as advanced as it is in the UK. I also think, supermarkets, we hear a lot about the influence they have, not always positive on the farming community in terms of driving down price. But they do also have, potential and have positive influences around incentivizing farmers to manage the land differently and to have environmental benefits, but also they could do the same around technology. So by funding, secure by design practices within the technology that's adopted, then we can hopefully drive greater resilience as well. And that is crucial, not just to the agri-tech sector. That secure by design point is the theme for Cyber UK next year. It's about baking in security from the start. So when these systems and technologies are developed, really thinking about the attack vector. And we, as we demonstrated in the report, it's only a subsection of the technology being used, but you can use fairly simple frameworks like the STRIDE framework to understand the threats and risks and use that to influence the direction that the technology goes in. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, that piece around security by design, and obviously, although this was a piece of work that was done around the agriculture sector, the parallels with other industries, with other sectors are really clear there, aren't they, in terms of this is just an example of one piece of critical national infrastructure where if we don't get this right, there's potentially some real implications, but that could happen across all sorts of different industries. Do you think, and particularly when we think about some of those bigger players, is there a role or an increased role for government and the public sector in how we can support those? So should we be trying to influence investors and vendors and tech providers to think about this a bit differently? Because I possibly in the Department for Agriculture, that's something that they're thinking about a lot, but possibly it's something that hasn't really occurred so far. Is there a role for government to do more in that, that's not the sort of siloed NCSC or those people?
I think there is. I don't want to sort of be overly kind of regulating things, and I'd like to think that the market can drive some of this, but absolutely there needs to be sort of minimum standards, which I think we're starting to see now. And there's obviously lots of guidance around secure by design from the NCSC, but then there was the legislation that went through recently around security of devices, IoT devices, which if that extends to the type of sensors that are used on farms, for example, then we start to get just lower and raising the basic level of security around those devices. But I think, there's an opportunity here, and that's the way we should probably look at it, a commercial opportunity, to be the best, to drive those secure by design principles into all the technology we develop in the UK, because that then becomes a differentiator, not just within our own market, but also internationally, and can hopefully drive opportunities for export and expansion into overseas markets as well. The UK's farming industry is large, but it pales into comparison when you look at Australia, the US, and other parts of the world. So I think if we could get it right on a scale here, there's a really, really big market opportunities to go after overseas.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. There's a piece there, isn't there, of if we get that right, how do we use this as a point of difference for UK PLC to be able to sell nationally and internationally? I think there's also, interestingly, from maybe from a CyNam point of view and the work that you've done, do you think there's further things that we could do with this project where we could scale those learnings? I know it was initially a piece of research, really, wasn't it, rather than coming up with a playbook or activities, but is there a phase 2 that we could do?
Yeah, I think this is, it was initially sort of badged as a discovery phase, so build that understanding both ways of the agri-tech sector, and then obviously help the agri-tech sector within our region understand the cyber security world as well. I think we've got to a point where we've got a way of doing that, and we've reached a number of stakeholders, but I'm very conscious of the fact that the agri-tech isn't just being developed in Gloucestershire. There's other parts of the country as well, and different types of technology. So types of technology in Gloucestershire are quite different to those, for example, in Lincolnshire and Norfolk and Suffolk, where the landscape is flat and wide open. So there's a lot more use of technologies around, that's more suited to that landscape in those parts of the world. So I think there's more we can do to publicise what we found, to take it nationally. Also, the National Cybersecurity Centre have recently, I think in recognition of the increased threat and the change in attack surface, have invested more resource into looking at agriculture and the development of agri-tech. So feeding some of our findings into that team so that they can be more widely distributed is also where we'd like to see this taken. So yeah, I would see a phase 2 being about maybe taking this nationally and linking into the major agri-tech hubs around the UK, and perhaps using the NCSC to give that the credence it needs.
Awesome. And that sounds really exciting. And if there's anything we can do as UKC3 to support that and wider things, I think there's some really interesting opportunities there. I've got a final question, and then unless there's any more coming in from the audience, we'll close it down. It's I guess a slightly more cynical, cheeky question, particularly where you're looking at agri-tech and agriculture in Gloucestershire. Do you think, because of the prevalence of cybersecurity in Gloucestershire, maybe there's a little bit of a better understanding and openness to those conversations that you maybe I'm being overly cynical about Norfolk, but you may not get in Norfolk, for example?
Yes, it's a really good question. I mean, I don't know the East Anglia kind of ecosystem at all, really. But I would say there wasn't, and we've still got a long way to go actually in terms of building that understanding within our own county. This is a start, and it's put it on the map, and it's, excuse the sort of slight play on words there, it wasn't deliberate. It's kind of put it within the mindset of people. But we didn't. None of the farmers or people in the agri-tech sector that we spoke to said, "Oh yes, well of course we're based in Gloucestershire, and NCSC and the big cyber communities down the doorstep, so we know all we need to know about cyber." It was quite the opposite. There really hadn't been any kind of thinking that the two sectors would overlap. It was mainly driven by ourselves and, say, friends at the Hartbury University there, where they kind of figured that there must be an overlap, and how can we explore that? So maybe because we've got a concentration of businesses here, that means that there's more likely to be that kind of cross-pollination over time. But and I mean, and I guess Norfolk and East Anglia, yes, certainly a more rural environments, but there are sort of big players within that area. So BT, for example, in I think it's around sort of Ipswich Way and Industrial Park. They've got lots of work and innovation activity going on there. So I think there's, I think it could absolutely work in other parts of the UK. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to be a business within that region working within a farm in that region. I guess the whole reason why we build the interconnected clusters that we do is that if there's expertise in a particular part of the UK, there can be opportunities for them to deliver that expertise in other regions, and vice versa. So I think the more the UKC3 continues its good work to connect up, the more it'll be easier to address these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it'd be a really interesting opportunity, and maybe one we'll pick up with Cyber East, because I can imagine that's something that would be hugely of interest. And it sounds like there's a lot more work and a lot of opportunity that could be taken out of extending that work for both our critical national infrastructure and for agri-tech businesses and for cyber businesses. So very much a win-win-win. I think what we'll do is close it down there, but thank you so much for that, Rich. It was really interesting, and a lot of food for thought of things that we can do and how we can continue to drive safety and security in the UK. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening. and for contributing today, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Thanks. Cheers, guys. Bye.